We are lucky enough to be here with Mr. Nik Hotchkiss. He is an expert in music creation, production, engineering, mastering. He is one half of the hip hop duo of Musab and Ink Well. And we are glad to be here talking to him about sound design. Welcome, Nik.
Hey, happy to be here.
Happy New Year already.
No, he said glad to be
Oh,
here.
I was like,
Uh,
I was
so
like,
I'm
is that a
spicy.
Canadian thing? Wow,
Yeah,
you guys
exactly. I
are
do have a
early.
Canadian accent. I'm from northern Minnesota, and it comes out a little bit heavy.
Oh, okay. I was like, I'm not ready. Can you take that back? Because I still have time to prepare.
I just got off a phone call with my mom, so that's probably what brought the accent back out a little bit.
I understand. So we wanted to talk to you a little bit about sound design, but first I wanted to ask you the question I ask everybody, which is, how did Nik Hotchkiss get into music?
Yeah. I, it's not like much different than most of us. It was just a passion project. I started in like junior high for me in garage bands with friends, just dabbling in, guitar and drums and writing lyrics and stuff like that. And then in high school, I joined the choir of my high school, and I wasn't, like a super great singer, but I also got into theater a little bit and would sing in some of the plays that I would do. But I always liked writing music. And then so when I was, graduating from high school, I had to start thinking about what am I going to do with my career. And I started DJing at first. So that was my real like kind of foray into it as a career, DJing high school dances and weddings, just kind of learning how to set up PA systems and do signal flow. And then also, just starting down the path of becoming an obsessive curator of a collection of music. I think that's what having a DJ background really helps as a producer as well, because you have a really deep bag to pull from in terms of your influences and your styling. So I kind of credit, just being a passive, listener of music at an early age. And my dad was really into music. So it was our kind of ritual on Sundays. He would put on, records from his vinyl collection, and we would just clean the house together. And so I got to, kind of start picking out records eventually, and that pretty much started it all. Yeah.
Nice. You've got a real producer's resume of things that you just mentioned there, which was like all of it. Musical theater, singing. I heard guitar. How many other instruments do you play?
Well, I'll be honest, I'm a studio musician, so I don't really feel comfortable on stage. I know enough like scales and chords, and I can get what I need in a performance in the studio, but I don't really consider myself much of a multi-instrumentalist, even though I do play, keys and guitar. Um, but yeah, like everything, you have to know enough to know that you don't like something. And in the modern era where we have hard drive space as cheap as it is, I just record until I find something I like, and then, get rid of what I don't like.
Nice. So, how would you describe sound design?
To me, that's a good one. Uh, I went to school for audio production, and when they taught us sound design, it was really from the vantage point of Hollywood, using it as, post-production sound effects and creating textures and things that would accompany television and film. But how I use it in my music production career, I almost think of sound design as being a simpler way of saying advanced synthesis. So just understanding how to create sound from its just component sine waves, really breaking it all the way down, getting into the Fourier sort of algorithm here, if you will, where everything in this entire universe is just a bunch of sine waves added in different amplitudes and frequencies. And if you're really, really into sound design, then that means that you're studying different types of synthesizers: subtractive synthesis, additive synthesis, vector synthesis, wavetable, like all the different ways of manipulating a raw waveform. And then you couple that with your experience in recording traditional musical instruments and sound effects, and you can come up with your own unique sound. So sound design to me is really just having a relationship with your sound, ideally from the inception of the vibration.
Nice. I love that explanation, especially about the vibration of everything in life in the world. Why do you think it's important? Because I know a lot of musicians don't necessarily think of their songs or their production from that standpoint. Why do you think sound design is so important?
It's kind of like, we have a tendency of being heavily influenced by our favorite creators, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I use the expression of a deep bag just a little while ago when we were talking about, sound design, but I also, or of a music collection kind of informing you as a music producer. I think of the same thing as for sound design, whereas if you're just kind of heavily influenced on the music that you are most inspired by, you're going to probably create sounds that you're already really familiar with because of your experience listening to these other artists and producers. Whereas a sound designer allows you to kind of get down to the initial thing that excited you about that producer's sound and allowing you to then carve your own kind of excitement from scratch in that vein. So I think it leads to both um, evolving the trends that you are influenced by. So picking up where somebody else left off and then, passing the torch. You're the new torch holder. And then it also, in a sort of a way, prevents us from chasing our own tails.
Mm.
Whereas if we're, a pop music producer, we might be influenced by the last 12, major songs that we really listen to. And if you're a jazz producer or something like that rather than a pop producer, you're probably inspired by a collection of jazz songs that, might date back decades or whatever, and that's kind of the vein that you like to produce your jazz music in. So every genre is susceptible to kind of following your predecessor's trends, but with sound design, it kind of bucks that a little bit, and it puts, I think, a little bit more of a special relationship into you, the producer's hands. And at the end of the day, that's what was probably going to make you even more proud of all of your productions, is knowing that you have a signature that, you developed.
Absolutely. It does. How much of it is experimentation?
I mean, I don't really know if there's a way to draw a line between experimentation and maybe purposefully, generating a sound, because synthesizers, the main tool that we're going to be using for sound design, in most cases are continuously variable, by definition. So even if there was the smallest increment or one bit that you could twist the knob, to change its timbre, another producer is never going to be able to get that exact same response as you on something that's continuously variable. So I don't know. It's just it's all experimentation. I would have to, like, I won't be able to set the knob exactly where I want to the moment I come up with a picture of the sound inside my head. I'm gonna have to finesse it until it matches that picture, and that's the process of the experimentation. But that's a good thing, I think.
I think. Well, yeah, I think
Turns it into a
experimentation.
process rather than just, if we could just instantly manifest the idea that we have in our head, then I think, there wouldn't be the journey, and the journey is the fun part.
Yeah. So, having said that, how how long have you been programming synthesizers, and where did you start? How did you? Is there a base for that? Because we're going to talk in a little bit about how you can be our base for that in teaching us sound design. But how did you start doing that?
Uh, my very first, like, keyboard that I ever inherited was from my father, and it wasn't anything special. I think I posed in a picture of it. It might even be that my profile picture, the one where I'm kind of like leaning on a keyboard. It's a really old Casio keyboard with, a little bit of FM synthesis in it, not much, not many programming capabilities. But I connected that to my very first DAW, which really didn't even process digital audio in, so to speak. It was like I think the second version of Cakewalk, which still at the time only handled MIDI. It would output audio through your sound card, but you couldn't actually record audio into it or edit audio, and it would just edit MIDI. So, my first productions were in like 1996 to 1998, when I was just graduating high school using that keyboard. And the beats that I were making back then, were simple, just general MIDI arrangements that I would tweak using what limited capabilities I had. But I also collected like some guitar pedals and stuff. So I didn't know this at the time, but that was kind of a way of injecting a little bit of modular synthesis into my productions. And I would connect those into the output of my MIDI keyboard so that I could add a little bit of extra, texture to it rather than just the stock, kind of sound card on the Casio. But to really, that was just my beginning into it. Most of my sound design, like learning synthesis, happened scholastically. So I did go to school for it, and they exposed me to some different software that I still to this day really enjoy using. And since then, I started, gradually collecting more and more synthesizers. But I don't think that's super necessary, especially in today's day and age when we have so many people that are making entire careers out of meticulously recreating a lot of our best synthesizers in the digital domain. And for what it's worth, the ability to be able to experiment with a digital synthesizer and then save settings and recall settings, all the stuff that we're familiar with and comfortable with, is so much more of a boon to me that I almost prefer soft synthesis over hardware synthesis. And I do like hardware, but yeah, I don't know. Where do I go with that? There's so many good synthesizers out there. The good news is unless you're wearing your developer hat and really trying to jump in and create your own, which is also something that I've just started going down the rabbit hole of programming more. And you're finding that a lot of our more advanced synthesizers have scripts that you can run inside them and learn how to program them. But I think just from an end user standpoint, not as a developer, almost all synthesizers are going to be calling on the same probably 5 or 6 different synthesis methods. So if you just learn the basics of synthesis, then you can apply that to almost all other synths.
Nice. So, and I forgot to mention to everybody before we started, because I was so excited to jump in and start talking to you. But if you guys have questions, we are going to have a question and answer period after the interview. But if you come up with a good question and you don't want to forget it, please go ahead and drop it in the chat, because we'll make sure that Nick answers that question for you.
I have the chat open right here too.
Nice. So let's talk a little bit about the course that you're teaching with us, Music Alliance. We talked a little bit about the fact that there's experimentation involved. But as a starting point, how important do you think it is to have a teacher, a mentor, somebody who can at least tell you like where that experimentation can start?
Okay, so I thought a lot about that just in how to approach, students when I'm teaching this sort of stuff. And the thing that I keep coming back to is that it's such a meticulous attention to detail oriented process oftentimes, at least, when I'm focusing on creating a sound from scratch, that somebody who hasn't really gone through sound design or hasn't really been too familiar with advanced synthesis, they might not go down that rabbit hole on their own, even if they wanted to, just because they didn't know that you should get that meticulous. Like, some people just, for what it's worth, they think the process should just be, as smooth as possible. And, maybe it's not discounting any other producers' techniques or whatever, and I often do this myself, where I'll go find a preset and then I'll study that preset to see exactly what makes it sound the way it does, see how all of the different parameters are organized, and then I learn, okay, so this is how that Reese bass is created or whatever it might be. And so what I'm getting at there is, and just picturing myself when I was first learning this, I wouldn't have probably spent nearly half the time going down the rabbit holes that I do now, just because I didn't think anybody else in the world would get that meticulous. But then being around a bunch of peers and other, instructors and stuff, I realized that, oh, no, you really do work for your sound. You really do sometimes spend more time just creating the sample base of what you're going to be using to write your music than it would be to actually write the music, so. And to me, again, that's part of the fun, is just having, aside from coming up with an awesome melody and a chord progression and some lyrics that mean something, that are very meaningful, that's, I think, the most important part. But then having your own unique stamp that just rides on all of those elements as the foundation, that to me gets really exciting. And that's the really meticulous part that I think a lot of people are on autopilot with until they get exposed to a deeper level of the process.
Yeah, I think we definitely think about branding as like your photos and your Instagram and your, the things that you put out visually, but there really is a big part of it that comes from your music, and I can imagine that sound design is
Yeah.
what makes that.
Yeah, totally. I mean, we all, as modern artists, we need exposure and we want to have a look, but really at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is be known for our sound. So I think you got to spend a little bit of time just getting right down to the individual sine waves that compose it. Learning why is a sawtooth wave different than a triangle wave? What kind of harmonics are in one of them that aren't in the other? Because that allows me to know, okay, here's how I would make an oboe as opposed to making the sound of a violin, like.
I love that you picked oboe as the reference. It
Yeah.
looks like St. Vonnie's got a question. Does the type of DAW you use matter? And if so, which DAW would you prefer?
For sound design, I do think the DAW itself is, one of the more important things. And I haven't tried every DAW out there, but I've demoed almost, most of the popular ones, and then I've had quite a bit of experience with, a lot of DAWs too. And in my opinion, the DAW that itself is a synthesizer, like the most automatable, the most modulated, most modulatable, if that's a word, DAW of all time would probably have to be Ableton. Like I can't think of too many parameters in the DAW that aren't able to be in some way modified and so with that being said, I use Ableton quite a bit as the main tool for sound design and synthesis. But when I'm recording and mixing and working in the studio, I do use a different DAW. So St. Vonnie, that's kind of an astute observation that, as a professional sound designer slash audio engineer slash music producer, you are probably going to have to get comfortable with a few different DAWs and then figure out how they handshake together best so that your workflow can kind of zip between them. But Ableton, yeah.
Can you tell us a few of the concepts of sound design that you teach in the course with us?
Well, yeah, my favorite salutation when I close off an email or something is always harmonic vibrations, and that kind of tucks to the root of my whole spiritual belief system here and how sound design's right at the very center of it. And so I start usually just by, again, looking at different sounds, like reverse engineering a sound to find out what sort of harmonic components are in it. And then how would we do that from scratch, just using maybe even just regular old additive synthesis? Before we had voltage control or any other form of, modulating synthesizers, we were just stacking together oscillators and, using the math, which this is the beauty of it is we all know that there's math encoded within our music.
Mm-hmm.
And our brain just kind of innately and subconsciously recognizes when the math behind our music is more perfect or more accurate than it is when it isn't. And so for an example, I kind of use this as a jump off point in the course to get people thinking about sound. If I was to just drag my fingernails down a blackboard or a chalkboard, yeah, most of us would cringe. And even when we think of the sound inside our heads, it's not a pretty sound. But if we were to analyze that under, a spectrograph or something and see what sort of frequency components are in it, we would notice that none of the frequencies in it are mathematically related to each other. They're not multiples of each other. They're just kind of random gradient sounds. And that's why our brain, as it strives to find the math in this, it doesn't, and it gets turned off. It doesn't get its little, dopamine drip because it's not happy. But when we hear a orchestra full of, 60 beautifully tuned instruments that are all harmonically on the same page, and they make a single moment in time that all of them are resonating together, the hairs on the back of our neck, stick up. It's because our brain in that singular second, or every second, every moment, is double checking the math behind all of the harmonics it's hearing. And when it hears something that is harmonically related and the math lines up and it makes more and more sense to your brain, it feels more and more rewarded and we become happy. And I think that's why music is such a universal language. And even if you don't understand the lyrics of a particular, culture or other language that you don't speak, you might still you probably still understand the emotional intention behind those lyrics, just the way that they are, ringing out with the music. So what the main fundamental concept I kind of like to teach in the class is just creating from, like, when you close your eyes and you envision a sound, whether or not you even hear that sound, like, what does it look like? Because sound is a three-dimensional thing that really does exist. We can't see it because, oxygen is invisible, and that's the medium it travels through when we're listening in our studio space here. But if we could just view the waves as they ripple around this studio and reflect off the walls, it's a beautiful thing. It would look a lot like us staring off into the cosmos and studying the orbits of all of our different planets and stuff. So I just try to get people to think in awe more about music as a place in this universe, and how we're all. I had this talk with Dawn the other day, actually. We're just thinking of, you have a choice in this world where you can kind of try to tune into your environment and then resonate sympathetically with it, and that would be like, the harmonic pattern of life. Or you can kind of fight the grain and just, be a bull in a china shop